In a moment, I'll talk to the editor of the Daily Telegraph about one of the biggest stories in the world. What could be more important than the origins of the coronavirus pandemic and China's defiant resistance to an independent investigation? So much is at stake here. Attempts to understand the true nature of the virus, ensuring viruses aren't spread so easily in the future, and dealing with the diplomatic fallout as China lashes out at the US and even threatens Australia because our government has dared to call for an investigation. Yet, even with these issues at stake, we're seeing pathetic and partisan media wars play out. Earlier this month, Sharri Markson of the Daily Telegraph and Sky News, of course, broke the story of a 15-page dossier produced by Western governments dealing with how China had suppressed information on the COVID-19 outbreak, covered up human-to-human transmission and therefore endangered the world. This was such a scoop on such an important issue that Markson was interviewed on top-rating US television.
The argument is that there's no evidence, firm evidence that it came from a lab, but there's no firm evidence it came from a wet market either. And what this dossier shows is that the Chinese authorities disinfected the wet lab, they bleached it before taking adequate environmental samples that could have perhaps verified or gone to verifying their case that it came from the wet market.
Markson's reporting matches what none other than the US Secretary of State has been saying.
Remember, China has a history of infecting the world, and they have a history of running substandard laboratories. These are not the first times that we've had a world exposed to viruses as a result of failures in a Chinese lab. And so while the intelligence community continues to do its work, they should continue to do that and verify so that we are certain. I can tell you that there is a significant amount of evidence that this came from that laboratory in Wuhan.
But extraordinarily, while world leaders demand transparency, and surely any concerned citizen on the planet would want to know the truth, journalists at our national broadcaster seem to think they already know.
So how likely is it that the virus escaped from that Chinese lab? Well, in short, it's not, despite concerns expressed by the Americans in 2018 about lax standards, and despite what President Trump has been saying. So, given all those expert doubts, was this sensational treatment really justified?
Batman! Exclusive!
We think not. We also think Markson should have told readers that almost every virus expert had dismissed the lab escape theory.
So Paul Barry and the ABC are certain the virus did not escape a lab. Brilliant work. Perhaps they should share their evidence because the world would like to know. After all, this virus seems to be as contagious as ABC groupthink.
The sort of barking mad nature of some of the statements coming out of the United States on this is a really good reason why we should be all pleased that the Prime Minister hasn't just backed the Americans on this and is saying, well, look, that's not our evidence.
Yeah, because the Trump administration is floating a laboratory angle, that's enough for the ABC, en masse apparently, to reject it.
Well, from wild claims about vaccines and the promotion of unproven cures, as well as competing baseless claims about a virus that was created in a lab and unleashed for nefarious purposes, the pandemic has been an opportunity for misinformation and disinformation. These notions have been promoted from two of the most powerful platforms in the world, the US presidency and the Chinese government, and way on down the chain from there.
How about the equivalence there between authoritarian China, the source of the virus, and democratic America suffering from it? Also, for a virus to escape a lab doesn't mean to say it was created in a lab. We're talking about the Wuhan Institute of Virology, where, of course, they have strict hygiene measures. Why? Because of the danger of infection. But for some reason, at the ABC, they just don't want to believe that this could possibly happen.
So we can say, according to the science, we can say pretty definitively this was not created, this virus was not created in the Wuhan lab. In terms of whether it got out of the lab, you're saying there's evidence pointing to Guangdong, and there's also evidence back in September that some kind of virus, virtually this virus, was around in France. So how did it get to Wuhan? And does that take us back to the wet market, or, and I hate to keep saying this, but could it take us back to the lab?
Could it take you back to the lab? Across at 9 newspapers, they ran a story trying to debunk Markson's story and to guess at her sources. Worryingly, they had two former Labor foreign ministers seemingly defending China, attacking the US, and showing an alarming lack of curiosity about the true source of the infection. Gareth Evans said pushing the Wuhan lab line in defiance of all intelligence assessments is just another nail in the coffin of US international credibility. And it's crucial for our own that we don't get further sucked into Trump's political agenda. And incredibly, not only does Bob Carr want an inquiry into Markson's leak, in other words, a probe to reveal her sources, he also claims to already know the answer. It seems the US Embassy gave a confected report to an Australian newspaper inflating baseless claims that the COVID-19 virus was hatched in a Chinese laboratory in Wuhan. That's what Carr says. So both Carr and Evans criticise anyone who criticises China, and they criticise the US, of course, and most extraordinarily of all, they claim to know where the virus did not come from. If they know where it did not come from, shouldn't they tell the world? Perhaps they'll know where it did come from. Perhaps they're awaiting word from China. It's amazing that many in the media are happy to accept these bizarre interventions.
Again, in Australia, like in the US, there are, of course, those left-wing sections of the media that don't want to believe that this virus may have leaked from a laboratory. And, of course, we don't know that yet. That's being investigated. But they don't want to even think about it. So, you know, already there have been attacks from that angle here as well.
Extraordinary, isn't it? Bob Carr doesn't want an investigation into where the virus came from. He wants to know where Sharri Markson's leak came from. Still, 9 newspapers reported yesterday that American intelligence agencies have uncovered data suggesting there was an emergency shutdown in October at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Apparently, there was no mobile phone activity in that laboratory for more than 2 weeks. So there you go. Just maybe something happened at the lab. We don't know. We need to know. And we simply can't be sure of where this virus came from until there's a full, independent, transparent investigation. And the only people in the world who reckon we don't need one of those are Xi Jinping and the Beijing Politburo. Oh, and also Bob Carr, Gareth Evans, Laura Tingle and Paul Barry. Let's catch up with the editor of the Daily Telegraph, Ben English. He joins me now via Skype. Thanks for joining us, Ben. This is a hell of a story that Sharri Markson broke. Are you surprised at how big and how strongly it's played out around the world?
No, I'm not surprised, actually, Chris. And good evening. How are you? Look, it was a sensational get. Even Paul Barry acknowledged that she got hold of this dossier. It was a dossier compiled by 2 governments, 2 members of the Five Eyes community governments. And, in fact, it has been examined also by members of the Five Eyes community. It wasn't an intelligence dossier. We never said that. And a lot of the criticism of the reportage was actually a bit of straw man sort of attacks where they're attacking what we never asserted. Another one of those, and you actually alluded to it, another one of those attacks was that we were somehow suggesting that it was created in a lab. There's no such suggestion of that. The dossier refers to the possibility that it escaped from the lab. It doesn't actually speculate on whether it was generated or mutated in the lab. It actually just examines whether, in fact, it's a possibility that it escaped from the lab. And, in fact, our reportage was meticulous. Sharri's reportage was very scrupulous in pointing out that, in fact, the Australians believe that on the basis of probability at that stage, when the article came out 2 weeks ago, it most likely did not come from the lab.
Yeah, but the point is that this lab is actually dealing in viruses like the coronaviruses we've seen in bats in China. So that's their job, is to deal with these viruses. Because of that, they, of course, have extraordinary hygiene and sterilisation methods. So that's because a lab like that worries about any breakdown where someone could get infected at work and take it outside the building. So obviously this is a possibility. As you say, the reporting hasn't said that it was a deliberately created virus or that it was deliberately released from the lab. It's really pointed to the possibility of an accident here. And I find it extraordinary that other media who haven't accessed the same information seem to be so certain. What, in order to shoot down this story, they're saying there's no way it could have come from the lab?
Yeah, look, I find it extraordinary too that if they're so certain about it, why don't they write that? Because that's a great scoop. No one actually knows with certainty where this virus emanated from, but somehow a lot of these writers are absolutely certain that it definitely didn't come from the Wuhan lab. That's extraordinary, and it shows me quite a puzzling lack of curiosity. And I think curiosity has got to be the basis of all journalism. So it really does puzzle me that they've leapt away from that. Then again, it doesn't really puzzle me, Chris, because I think it's basically part of the proxy war against Trump by elements of the left. So whatever Trump or his administration seems to assert, they must position themselves against that, in my view.
Yeah, it's a weird sort of a conspiracy theory, isn't it, that anything Trump says must be wrong, and there must be right-wing media out there as part of some grand conspiracy. We've seen the same thing with, of course, with the hydroxychloroquine, a drug that a lot of doctors say holds out hope for treatment of COVID-19 sufferers. There's even official trials going on in Australia and other countries, yet because Trump has promoted it, with his usual invective and overblown rhetoric, but because he's doing that, they say the drug must not work. I mean, don't we actually want to get to the facts of these issues?
That you've absolutely nailed. It's people are forgetting about the actual journalism, and the construction of a story has to be the gathering of facts. If you leap to a conclusion that, the problem here is they're judging who is emitting the information, who is transmitting the information, and as soon as it comes from Trump, therefore it must be discredited. Whereas great journalism would be actually examining that and interrogating it and fact-finding.
This is a very important point, Ben, because this goes to a lot of the public debate now. Instead of examining the facts, there are judgments about possible motives. People are speculating and assuming motives rather than just dealing with the facts.
Well, that's right. And there's a lot of cynicism about what the White House comes out with and the broader Trump administration, but not so much cynicism about what China is proclaiming. I mean, the information that we're relying upon largely about the Wuhan lab and how the virus developed from, say, November onwards, we're relying on Chinese information. But I don't know why we should necessarily take that on its face value. Shouldn't we be interrogating every element of this? And that is why, to me, it makes perfect sense that we have an independent inquiry as to the genesis of this virus, free, basically free of any fear or favour of where it came from.
Now, this is where it gets very worrying for me. I asked Bob Carr on this program, on my 5 o'clock program a couple of weeks ago, whether he supported an independent inquiry with the cooperation of China to find out the true source of this virus. And Bob Carr very quickly parlayed his answer into an attack on how Donald Trump had handled the pandemic, skirted around that question. Yet in this article in the 9 media newspapers just a few days ago, Bob Carr is promoting an investigation in Australia as to who leaked this dossier to Sharri Markson. And furthermore, even though he's calling for the investigation, he decides he knows who leaked it to her. He says it was the US Embassy. I mean, is this disturbing about this level of political probing into the sources of journalists coming from none other than Bob Carr? Not only was he a former Premier and former Foreign Minister, he was a former journalist.
They've gone to an ex-politician who is as much a Chinophile and is captured by the Chinese interests as anyone, perhaps with the exception at one stage of Sam Dastyari. And he's the subject of that story. Bob Carr doesn't want an inquiry into the Chinese cover-up. He wants an inquiry into the dossier that lays bare that cover-up. Try and work that out.
It is extraordinary. It is extraordinary. And I know one place, though, where they'll be applauding that arrangement, and that is in Beijing. It's great stuff. It's a fascinating issue, and thanks for joining us, Ben. I appreciate it.